Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The flickering lamplight in my grandfather's study cast long, dancing shadows across the walls as he settled into his chair, a wistful look in his eyes. "I was just a young man back then," he began, his voice heavy with memories. "Barely old enough to shave, but old enough to hold a rifle and be sent deep into the jungles of Vietnam." His hands trembled slightly, a reflex from decades past, as he described the muggy, suffocating heat of the Southeast Asian wilderness. The mission, he explained, had been classified. 12 soldiers, strangers bound by war, were tasked with patrolling a stretch of dense, hostile jungle rumored to be crawling with enemies and echoes of something unexplainable. Grandfather introduced us to his companions, Corporal Jameson, with his gruff, no-nonsense demeanor, but a heart of gold hidden beneath a camouflage of steel. Private Winters, a fresh-faced kid who often spoke of his family farm back home, and Sergeant Tucker, the seasoned leader whose silence spoke volumes. Each man carried not only a rifle, but also the burden of stories left unfinished. Their journey began in the sweltering heat of a sun that bled through the canopy above. They trudged through ankle-deep mud, sweat soaking through their uniforms, and the ever-present hum of insects gnawed at their ears. It was more than just physical exhaustion that wore them down. There was something different about this patch of jungle, something that felt alive in ways that defied understanding. 3 days and 2 nights, Grandfather sighed, his voice growing quieter. That was how long we were meant to hold out, to patrol and report any activity. We should have known better. Though, the jungle doesn't just watch you, it waits. And in the darkest nights, it remembers. They made camp the first night on a slight rise overlooking a narrow river, the kind of spot that offered a false sense of security. As darkness fell, so did an oppressive silence, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves. It was as if the jungle itself was drawing a breath, ready to exhale at any moment. The men kept their weapons close, their eyes darting to every shadow. Jameson muttered about ghost stories he had heard from the locals, tales of lost spirits wandering the jungle. Private Winters chuckled nervously, trying to mask his fear, but his eyes betrayed him. No one could quite shake the feeling that something was off. Even Sergeant Tucker seemed uneasy, his gaze scanning the darkness as if he could sense something creeping just out of sight. Grandfather paused, taking a long breath, but that was only the beginning. He whispered, his eyes clouded with a mix of nostalgia and lingering fear. "Little did we know that the first night was only a taste of the nightmare waiting for us in the heart of that cursed land." Grandfather's voice grew huskier as he described the night that bled into a living nightmare. "We took turns keeping watch," he said, the memory slicing through his tone. "It was supposed to be simple. Stay awake, watch for movement, and listen. But that jungle was hiding more than just enemy soldiers. The night air was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Corporal Jameson was the first to notice it, the unnatural stillness. The familiar rustle of leaves and the hum of insects had been replaced by an eerie quiet, as though the jungle itself had frozen in time. Jameson nudged Sergeant Tucker, his whisper barely audible. "Something's wrong," he murmured. The men gripped their rifles tighter, straining to see past the shadows dancing in their limited circle of flashlight beams. Private Winters, who had been trying to suppress his nerves all night, shivered when a sudden chill swept through their camp, raising goosebumps along his neck. The temperature had inexplicably dropped, and a thick fog had begun to coil through the undergrowth, wrapping around their boots and blurring their vision. Grandfather described how he and his fellow soldiers leaned in, their breaths shallow and their minds racing. Suddenly, a crackling sound pierced the air. It was the static of an old radio, the kind that had no business being out there in the heart of the jungle. They all turned to look at Private Harris, who was in charge of the squad's communications. His hands were trembling as he tried to adjust the dials on their field radio. But Harris hadn't even switched it on. The equipment was as dead as the haunted silence around them. The static turned into whispering, a garbled mess of Vietnamese and English. The voice was distorted, echoing with an otherworldly quality that chilled them to their bones. It called out names that belonged to the dead. Private Jenkins, it hissed. Corporal Lee. The names kept coming, the radio whispering a roll call of soldiers who had gone missing in action over the years. Men whose bodies had never been recovered. Sergeant Tucker barked out orders, trying to rally his men and restore order, but even his voice wavered. Get a grip. Everyone, he commanded. It's just a trick of the mind, nothing more. But his authority didn't erase the fear that had crept into their hearts. Grandfather described how his own pulse raced as shadows in the mist began to take shape. It wasn't just fog anymore, it was movement, spectral figures that drifted in and out of sight. Men in tattered uniforms, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering for help. Some clutched ghostly wounds, while others reached out with translucent hands, their faces twisted in agony and sorrow. Private Winters backed away, his eyes wide with terror. This isn't happening, he whispered, but his voice betrayed him. One of the ghostly figures stopped and turned toward him. Its face was blank, but its gaze seemed to pierce through the veil between life and death. The jungle shivered, and an unearthly wail echoed through the trees, making every soldier's heart pound like a drum. I wish I could say it was all a nightmare, Grandfather said, his voice thick with regret. But the longer we stayed, the more real it became, and not all of us would survive to see the sunrise. Grandfather's eyes grew darker as he recounted the horrors that unfolded on that cursed patrol. We huddled close together, our rifles clutched tight. Fear isn't something easily shaken off, and that night, it wrapped itself around us like a smothering blanket. The spectral fog had swallowed the jungle, muffling even the sharpest sounds. The radio's whispers had faded, but the memory of the dead men's names lingered, their echoes haunting each soldier. Sergeant Tucker forced himself to remain composed, but the strain was evident. Eyes open, weapons ready, he ordered, his voice cracking like brittle wood. Corporal Jameson took point, leading the platoon away from the thickest part of the fog. We've got to move, he whispered, hoping that distance would bring some semblance of safety. But with each step, the jungle seemed to close in, branches twisting like gnarled fingers and shadows warping into grotesque forms. Private Harris stumbled and fell, cursing as his rifle clattered beside him. As he scrambled to get up, he froze. His mouth opened in a silent scream, eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. What is that?" he stammered, pointing into the mist. Grandfather described how the entire platoon turned, their breath hitching. Just beyond the tree line stood a figure, a soldier. His uniform was American, but impossibly faded, and his skin was an unnatural gray. He had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets. The ghostly soldier raised one hand, and with a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind, he said, "Why didn't you save us?" Corporal Lee stepped forward, his hands trembling. "We have to keep moving," he insisted, his voice desperate. "We have to get out of here before we all lose our minds." But, as he took another step, something cold and unseen yanked him back. He screamed as invisible hands dragged him into the mist, his cries echoing into the void until they abruptly stopped. Panic erupted. The platoon scattered, desperately trying to pull Lee back, but he had vanished into the swirling fog. "Hold your positions," Sergeant Tucker yelled, though his own voice was breaking. He fought to maintain control, but the men were breaking down. Private Winters was sobbing, his hands covering his ears as though trying to block out the whispers. Grandfather paused, a haunted look in his eyes. "The jungle was alive with spirits that night," he said. "We tried to hold our ground, but the ghosts, they weren't just memories. They were angry. They were hungry. The ground beneath them shivered, and out of the darkness came the sound of boots stomping, weapons clanking, an entire spectral battalion marching. The ghosts of soldiers who never left Hill 364 stepped forward, their hollow eyes fixed on the living. They moved in unison, an army of the damned, reliving their last moments of anguish and rage. Retreat, Sergeant Tucker finally ordered, his face pale. The platoon began to pull back, but with every step, the ghosts closed in, their silent wails becoming a terrible chorus. Grandfather took a deep breath, the memory weighing heavy on him. We didn't know if we were running away from danger or deeper into it, he said, but what choice did we have? Grandfather's voice quivered slightly as he picked up the story. We ran, our boots pounding through the jungle floor. The night air was heavy with mist and the smell of decay, but no matter how fast we moved, the whispers stayed with us, rustling like the wind through dead leaves. Sergeant Tucker struggled to maintain order as panic set in. "Stay together," he shouted, his voice commanding yet edged with fear. But the chaos was relentless. Soldiers stumbled over roots and vines, each fall met with a desperate scramble to get back up. The ghostly soldiers continued their march, their forms shimmering in and out of visibility, like nightmares that refused to disappear. Private Winters was the next to break. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his helmet as tears streamed down his face. "They're calling my name," he sobbed, his fingers digging into his temples. I hear them. Corporal Jameson tried to pull him up, but it was no use. The shadows around Winters seemed to solidify, taking the shape of soldiers with sunken eyes and open wounds. They reached for him, whispering with voices filled with sorrow and rage. Grandfather's eyes clouded over, as if he could still see the horror. We tried to save him, but the hands of the dead, they dragged him into the darkness. His screams were swallowed by the mist, and then there was nothing. The platoon pressed onward, fear gnawing at their resolve. The jungle itself felt hostile, the twisted trees and underbrush forming a labyrinth that seemed determined to keep them trapped. They reached a clearing, and for a moment there was silence. Only the heavy, labored breathing of the remaining soldiers punctuated the night. Sergeant Tucker took a shaky breath, surveying what was left of his men. "We can't lose hope," he said, though his own face was pale. He tried to sound confident, but the words rang hollow. "We'll set up a perimeter here and regroup." They formed a defensive circle, their rifles trained on the shifting shadows. Corporal Lee, still shaken from nearly being pulled away earlier, whispered, "Why here? Sarge, why does this place feel wrong?" Grandfather described how, even in the heart of a haunted jungle, that clearing felt different. It was eerily quiet, as if the very air held its breath. Then, in the distance, came the faint sound of a radio signal, crackling and buzzing, like a distress call from beyond the grave. Private Harris adjusted his radio equipment, his hands trembling. "It's picking up something," he whispered. He twisted the dials, and a ghostly voice crackled to life. "This is Echo Company. Hill 364, we need immediate extraction. Casualties, so many casualties." The blood drained from everyone's faces. Hill 364, the name echoed through their minds. A place that had become infamous for a bloody battle that left no survivors. The radio signal continued, looping over and over, repeating a desperate call for help that had gone unanswered for years. Private Rodriguez, usually the most skeptical of the group, whispered, This isn't real. It's some sick trick." But as he spoke, the ghostly figures began to emerge from the mist, stepping into the clearing. Their faces bore expressions of agony, and their eyes were hollow voids that seemed to consume light. One of the specters, a lieutenant with half his face blown away, stepped forward. His voice was raspy, a guttural echo. "Why didn't you come for us?" he demanded, his words seething with betrayal. The living soldiers recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. Grandfather's hands trembled slightly as he described the moment. We were surrounded by the spirits of those who had fallen, reliving their pain, their anger. It was as if they blamed us for something we couldn't even comprehend. Sergeant Tucker tried to shout an order, but his voice faltered. Fear had taken root in every heart. The ghosts advanced, their anguish palpable, their presence suffocating. The platoon was trapped in the clearing, standing at the edge of sanity as the past came back to claim them. Grandfather's voice grew solemn, the weight of memory pressing down on him. The clearing was a battlefield of souls, and we were the unwelcome intruders. Those spirits, those restless dead, they surrounded us with their sorrow and rage. Their pain felt like it was seeping into our bones. Sergeant Tucker, who had always been the strong one, now appeared pale and desperate. His voice cracked as he barked orders. "Hold your ground," he yelled, though the terror in his eyes told a different story. The soldiers' hands trembled on their rifles. How could bullets defend them from the dead? One ghost stepped forward, a young soldier in a tattered uniform with wounds that still bled phantom blood. His eyes, blank and staring, were fixed on Private Harris. "Why didn't you save me?" the specter whispered, its voice full of aching betrayal. Harris's knees buckled, his face as white as a sheet. Private Rodriguez clenched his jaw, his fear twisting into anger. "We don't owe you anything," he shouted, but his defiance rang hollow. The ghost turned its gaze on him, and Rodriguez faltered, taking a step back. The haunting silence was broken only by the murmurs of the dead, their laments weaving through the mist. Corporal Lee, who had been silent for too long, suddenly spoke up. His voice was low and shaking. "Sarge, there has to be a way to make this stop," he pleaded. His hands clutched his rifle, but the weapon felt useless. Maybe they need us to hear them out, to know their story." The radio signal, still emitting that looped distress call from Hill 364, crackled louder. The air felt thick, and the jungle seemed to close in tighter. The ghostly figures swirled closer, their forms flickering with each step. It was then that a new voice cut through the tension, deep and commanding. "You have no place here," the voice intoned, echoing with an unnatural force. A figure stepped from the darkness, dressed in an old officer's uniform, but his face was obscured by shadows. The other spirits retreated slightly, as if in reverence or fear. This ghost was different. He exuded an authority that made even the dead shiver. Grandfather described how Sergeant Tucker stood frozen, his mouth open but no sound coming out. This ghostly officer locked eyes with Tucker. "You tread on sacred ground," he said, his voice like gravel. "We were abandoned here, left to rot in our final moments. You have awakened our suffering." Private Jenkins, usually the platoon's joker, whispered in a panic, "We're not the enemy. We're just here by mistake." His voice was choked with desperation, but the ghostly officer's expression did not soften. "Your presence disrupts our peace," the officer replied. "To leave, you must honor the dead. Acknowledge the sacrifice we made." His spectral form wavered, and for a moment, it seemed like he was reliving his final moments on the battlefield. He clutched his chest, as if feeling the pain of a bullet that had ended his life. Sergeant Tucker swallowed hard, his voice finally returning. "We don't mean to dishonor you," he said, his tone steadier but full of sorrow. "We're just soldiers like you were, sent here, doing what we were ordered to do." The jungle fell silent, the whispers of the dead momentarily stilled. The ghostly officer's eyes, deep pools of endless sorrow, fixed on Tucker. "Words are not enough," he said, and the mist around him thickened, swirling like a living thing. "You must understand our torment." Then, the jungle itself seemed to shatter, the ground trembled, and visions overtook the soldiers' visions of Hill 364, of the desperate battle fought there. They saw explosions, heard the screams of the dying, and felt the fear of men who knew their end was near. The platoon was thrown into a nightmare, reliving the final moments of those who had perished. Grandfather's voice grew quiet. We were forced to walk in their boots, to feel the horror of being left behind, of knowing no one was coming to save us. We experienced the terror that those lost souls had endured. The visions faded, leaving the platoon gasping, shaken to their cores. The ghostly officer watched them, his expression unreadable. "Now," he whispered, "you understand." But the ordeal was far from over. The spirits watched, waiting for a sign that the living understood the gravity of what had transpired. The platoon was at a crossroads, either find a way to honor the fallen or remain trapped in this haunted jungle forever. Grandfather's voice grew heavy with the weight of those final moments, his eyes distant, lost in memories of that fateful patrol in the haunted jungle. We stood there, our souls as battered as our bodies. He began. The spirits of the dead had made us understand their torment, but they weren't finished with us yet. We still needed to make peace. The ghostly officer, his form flickering in the moonlight, regarded the exhausted and terrified soldiers of the Lost Platoon. His voice, full of both pain and authority, echoed through the jungle. "You have seen our suffering, felt our fear," he intoned. "Now, will you honor our memory?" Sergeant Tucker, who had somehow managed to remain strong through everything, nodded. His voice was hoarse, but resolute. "We will," he promised. "We will remember you and your sacrifice." The platoon gathered together, and in that clearing, they built a simple but heartfelt memorial. They used whatever they had, stones, branches, and even spare dog tags they carried in their packs. Each man contributed something, offering a piece of themselves to the fallen. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for their tribute to be complete. Private Harris, still pale and haunted by the ghost who had whispered to him, knelt down and placed a small notebook he had always kept in his pocket. It contained letters he had written to loved ones but never sent. "I understand now," he said quietly, as though speaking to the ghost that had accused him. "I understand what it means to be forgotten." As the memorial took shape, a change washed over the jungle. The oppressive mist began to thin, the whispering voices of the spirits growing fainter. The ghostly figures that had surrounded them now watched from a distance, their features less twisted by sorrow and rage. The ghostly officer stepped forward one last time. "Your promise has been heard," he said. "You have shown respect to those who came before you." His form seemed to shimmer, becoming less solid with every word. "But beware, this place will always remember." With that, the ghostly officer and his fellow spirits began to fade into the shadows, their restless energy dispersing into the night. The jungle fell silent, a quiet peace settling over it. The moonlight now shone gently through the trees, casting a silver glow over the simple memorial the platoon had built. Sergeant Tucker turned to his men. They were exhausted, their faces lined with fear and fatigue, but there was a newfound understanding among them. They had survived something few would ever believe, and they had done it together. "We need to get out of here," Corporal Lee finally said, breaking the silence. His voice wavered, but there was relief in his eyes. "Before the jungle changes its mind." The platoon picked up their gear, their movements sluggish but determined. They left the clearing, making their way back to their base camp. The journey was long, and the jungle was still dark and full of shadows, but the spirits no longer tormented them. It was as if the jungle had released them from its grasp. Grandfather took a deep breath, his story coming to an end. "We made it back after those 3 days and 2 nights, battered but alive. No one ever talked about what really happened out there, not officially, but we remembered. We always remembered." His audience, gathered around in the dim light, sat in stunned silence. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across their faces. One of the listeners, a young boy with wide eyes, finally spoke up. "Grandpa, do you think those spirits are still out there?" Grandfather's eyes grew solemn, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. "Oh, they're still out there," he said. "The jungle never forgets." But as long as we remember them, honor them, perhaps they'll watch over us rather than haunt us. And with that, he leaned back in his chair, the ghost of 1,000 memories in his gaze, as the past and present blended in the quiet of the night. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.